And welcome everybody back to another episode of the Handsome Homebuyer Podcast. My name is Charles, aka the Handsome Homebuyer, aka Captain Permit, aka aka the LLS 2020 Man of the Year. I'm not the Man of the Year yet. Obviously, it's not 2020, but we're going to speak it into existence. That's the way I do things. That is also the theme, or part of the theme, of today's podcast. Because 5 years ago, I was in real estate, and they said, "Kid, you can't flip a house. It's impossible. You can't get it done. The world is crashing. Everything's falling apart. You can't do it. You come from a normal middle-class area. Just go do this, follow that track, do what your father did." 5 years, 300 houses later, here we are. And then they say, "Kid, you can't do commercial development. It's impossible. The big guys run Long Island. It can never happen." Went back to NYU. Here we are, first year doing commercial. Half a dozen monster projects in the works, under contract, ranging from assisted living, self-storage, big multifamily, doing huge things. So if there's anybody out there who tells you you can't do it, I tell you to tell them maybe you can't do it, but anything is possible. Maddie, you know who else can do anything? Captain Permit. 516-513-8838. If you need plans, if you need permits, if you need anything building related, legalizations, new construction, new houses, commercial, we have the best team in the business. 516-513-8838. And obviously, I'm the Handsome Homebuyer. If you have a house that smells like cat pee, is dated from the 1960s, has 6 inches of mold on the wall, human waste running past the basement steps, all true stories. I'm quick, I'm easy, I'm all cash, I'm a good time. I want to buy it. So we have an unbelievable guest today. We started this podcast, I say 3 years ago, and people are like, "Why are you doing this podcast? Charles, is ridiculous. No one's ever going to want to listen to it." We started in a cockroach-filled basement, I was just telling our guests, 300, maybe 500 square feet in Levittown, for those of you who know Long Island. And today, we are on the top of the universe, the top of the world, with an unbelievable guest at 75 Rock Plaza, RXR's headquarters. Today's guest, absolute rock star. I wrote down for the first time the resume, which is intense. I filled half a page, but I had to cut it off because otherwise we'll be here for 45 minutes just running down the accomplishments. So this gentleman, currently the Executive VP of Investment Management for RXR, leading RXR's effort to invest in emerging opportunities. Prior to RXR, he served as Director of Mayor Bloomberg's Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resilience, which developed a $20 million plan. Did I get that right? Billion. Sorry about that. Changed the M to a B. $1 billion plan to help neighborhoods stricken by Sandy. He was the president of the NYC Economic Development Corporation. There we go. Boom. Appointed by Mayor Bloomberg in 2008, he served as lead negotiator on behalf of New York City for projects such as Yankee Stadium, Citi Field, World Trade Center, Hunters Point South. He had advanced initiatives such as the redevelopment of Willets Point, Coney Island, Homeport in Staten Island, and the King Bridge Armory in the Bronx. He's also more powerful than a locomotive and can leap tall buildings in a single bound. It is indeed an honor, Mr. Seth Pinsky. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it. So I want to start this off with a very quick story about how we met, and I'm honored that you remembered me. Apparently, I leave a lasting impression, which is good. So sometimes you meet people, and they come into your life for a minute, and they change your life forever, and I mean that. And when I went back to school at NYU, a lot of people were like, why are you doing it? Like, "Charles, you bought 89 houses last year. Why would you go back to NYU?" I remember when I was a kid, you know the band Coldplay?
Yep.
So it's weird what you remember as a kid. So Coldplay won some kind of crazy, like, triple platinum, whatever, $1 million. And they said Coldplay went back and got voice lessons after they won this crazy award. And that's always what I thought. I'm like, if I'm going to get to the next level of development, which is what you guys do, better than anybody at RXR, coming from Long Island, which is very cool also, I need to be around that energy, and I need to learn from those people. So I had a class where every week the professor would bring in another unbelievable guest that's like a rock star in the industry to speak, and you came in. And I am currently doing a project with the Oceanside Jewish Center in Oceanside where I'm subdividing 2.5 acres of the 4 acres, and I'm going to build something there. And I wanted to reach out to the community in a very unique and different way, because the community would always complain and say, developers just go out there, they build whatever they want, and they just kind of ram it down our throat and don't tell us or ask us. And the way you spoke about all the things you've done on both the public and private side and how you deal with the community basically changed my whole game plan. So what I did was I created a YouTube video for the community to tell them exactly what we're going to do. I came up with 5 unique concepts that were both economically viable and there was a demand for, that I felt like they would like, and I issued ballots and I had them vote on it. And I remember you said to me, there's going to be people that are loud. Make sure that you speak to the loudest ones and make sure that you are open and honest and completely forthcoming with everything. And I did that. And it was an amazing experience. And there were some people that did not like me and probably still don't. But in general, the feedback I got from the majority of the people were, thank you.
That's great. That's an encouraging story.
Thank you for, so I want to thank you for that, because I will forever, that is forever impacting me. I will forever be different and approach development in a unique way. Ironically, after all that, to pat myself on the back a little bit, I'm receiving an award there, this thing called the Real Awards that's given out by the Herald for the way I went and dealt with the community. So
congratulations on that.
That's as much mine as yours.
Congratulations.
So now I know people aren't here to hear me. They obviously want to hear about your amazing career and what you've been through. So a little bit of background, where you grew up. I know you were telling me before you jumped around from Long Island to Jersey.
Yeah, so my father was a rabbi, so I followed him from congregation to congregation. When I was born, we lived in Great Neck. Then moved to New Jersey for a few years, and then my father came home one day and said, good news, we're all moving to Minnesota. So I moved at age 10 to Minnesota, and actually had a great time there. It's a great state. Minneapolis is a great city, but I think as we were crossing the St. Croix River from Wisconsin to Minnesota, we drove out to our new house. I said to my father that as soon as I'm able to make the decision, I'm getting back to New York. And so that's what I did when I went to college.
Nice. Can you speak Hebrew?
Not very well, but some.
But you can understand it?
Yeah.
Are you a big hockey fan?
Yeah, I do like hockey, actually.
Nice. Because obviously Minnesota's the center of the hockey world.
Yep.
Outside of Con. So after that, I know you, prior to going into government, you were an attorney.
Yeah, so I worked, coming out of college, I worked in banking for a couple of years, then went to law school and became a lawyer, and worked as a corporate lawyer for about 5 years. About 3 years into my time as a lawyer, September 11th happened.
Okay.
And we were, our offices were directly across the street from the World Trade Center. Fortunately, wow. I wasn't there that day, although I was in Washington and had a harrowing experience there. But we were out of our offices for a number of months as a result of that. And then when we came back, my office, which previously had been looking into the World Trade Center, was now overlooking the wreckage of the World Trade Center. And I would sit and watch the recovery efforts. And as I watched that, what I realized was that I really wanted to get involved in the rebuilding of New York. And so that was the moment when I decided that I was going to try to get into New York City government.
I'm curious to know, going into law, why did you go into law? Were you passionate about that? What drew you to that? Or was it just something that you kind of, like a lot of people just follow a certain path or?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was that's what Jewish kids do, is they either
lawyers or accountants or doctors.
Yeah, and I didn't want to be a doctor, so I decided I would be a lawyer. But no, when I went into banking, which it was a job that I literally just fell into, I always thought that being in public service at some point in my career would be something that I'd want to do. Mm-hmm. And so I very intentionally took the LSAT before I started working, because I wanted to make it as easy as possible for me to go to law school, because my thought was that if I went to law school, that would eventually lead me into government. Okay. In fact, when I started law school, what I said to anyone who would listen was, I don't exactly know what kind of law I want to do, but the one thing I know is I don't want to go work for a large corporate law firm. And of course, 3 years later, that's exactly what I ended up doing, was going to work for a large corporate law firm. And it was a great experience, but I knew pretty early that wasn't my calling.
Okay. I mean, did you feel from a very young age that you wanted to serve the community, that you wanted to serve the public? Was that?
Yeah, I mean, having a father who was a rabbi,
yeah.
That was it's kind of part of the ethos of our house. And then I had a grandfather who had been a judge and a city councilman in Yonkers many, many years ago, and he always talked very enthusiastically about the experience of being in government. So those two things kind of pushed me in that direction.
Interesting. It's always like, I always like to dig in and kind of see where people came from and like what shaped them ultimately to do what they do. So, I mean, at that point, you saw what happened September 11th. You had that moment where you really like, this is my calling, I'm going to work in government. And how did it proceed from there?
So, I started a search, and as I mentioned, it was about 3 years into my time as a lawyer. And as I also mentioned, I was a lawyer for 5 years, so It took me a while. And I went down a number of dead ends. I tried to get involved with the state, which at that time was taking the lead in the rebuilding downtown, and just nothing panned out. And so at a certain point, I got very frustrated, and I happened to go out to lunch with someone that I'd worked with in banking, and I told her my tale of woe. And at the end of it, she said, well, have you spoken to anyone at the New York City Economic Development Corporation? And I said, I definitely haven't, because I don't know what the Economic Development Corporation is. And so she explained to me what it was, and she put me in touch with someone there. And it was very early in the Bloomberg administration, and a lot of people at the EDC and a lot of people in city government more generally were people who had backgrounds that were very similar to mine. So I immediately felt comfortable with those people and the way that they thought. And I decided, okay, well, this is as good a time as any to take a 2/3 pay cut. And so I did exactly that, and ended up making the move to the EDC.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I try to. So as I transition into commercial real estate this year is kind of like just a redirection and changing year. So last year I did 89 houses. This year we'll probably do about 30 to 40 houses for a couple of reasons. A, the market is dramatically changing, which we'll talk about later. B, you can't always be on the up and up. Like sometimes you have to take a step back in order to take 3 steps forward later on. I'm curious to know, coming from a family that was, in law for generations, seemed like, what did they say about your decision to leave law? Were they supportive of it? What was? Yeah, no,
they generally were quite supportive. As I said, public service and being involved in the community was something that was always a value in my house and in our family. I think people knew that I really liked the firm that I worked at, and I had learned a lot, but they knew that it wasn't what I wanted to do for my entire life. And it's now hard to imagine that people ever felt this way, but after September 11th, there was a general feeling that that government would play an important role in turning the city around. And so I think that they bought into the motivation that I had for wanting to get involved and to see if we could do something to help restore the New York, which was a place that I deeply care about.
So I want you to explain for everybody who's listening, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding as far as what the EDC does or what the IDA does. I think, people, like I hear it all the time, people are like, oh, like as a developer, they're just giving you money, it's millions or billions or whatever it is. And I don't think they truly understand the responsibility and how helpful and how necessary it is to grow the community.
So the New York City Economic Development Corporation is a fairly unique institution. It really doesn't exist in most other places around the country. And what happened was that in the early 90s under Mayor Dinkins, the city basically realized that the things that it needed to do in order to attract businesses and investment, it just wasn't able to do within the restrictions that exist in city government. And so it set up an independent not-for-profit, which was the EDC. And the EDC operated and continues to operate under a contract with the city. The board is appointed, the majority of the board is appointed by the mayor. So it's essentially functions as if it were a city agency, but legally it's not a city agency. And as a result of that, it's able to do things and it's able to operate with a level of efficiency that most city agencies aren't able to operate with. And so the result of that has been that basically in each mayoral administration, as the mayor comes into office and realizes what a powerful tool the EDC is, the EDC is given more and more responsibility. So today, the EDC in New York has a portfolio of industrial properties that it manages on behalf of the city, places like the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center, the Brooklyn Army Terminal. It's responsible for selling surplus land that agencies no longer need and to put it into private use. It undertakes significant capital projects on behalf of the city. Billions of dollars in capital flow through the EDC on behalf of New York City government. And then another thing that was really critical when the Bloomberg administration was in office was, first of all, there's a group in EDC that looks at neighborhoods and says, which are the neighborhoods in the city that need to be thought of more comprehensively and redeveloped, and it leads the effort to develop the plans for redeveloping those places. And then the other function, which was a function that really was created under Mayor Bloomberg, was a function that was designed to think more strategically about the economy of the city. So we would feed questions to this group, like, for example, New York is the media capital of the United States, but the media industry is changing dramatically. What does New York City need to do in order to maintain its position as the media capital? Or the technology industry isn't growing in New York as fast as in other places. What do we need to do to grow it faster? So it's a wide range of responsibilities. And then one other, which you alluded to, you talked about the IDA, which is the Industrial Development Agency. That actually is a state agency that every county in New York State has an IDA. And in New York City, the 5 counties that make up New York City have one IDA. So there's the New York City Industrial Development Agency. The IDA is empowered by the state to exempt certain taxes. So when you hear about tax benefit deals, that's run through the IDA, and EDC, among its many responsibilities, has the responsibility for administering the IDA.
Yeah, and I mean, how vital would you say the EDC, the IDA are to just, growing a local economy? I don't think people realize how important that is.
So I think you can both understate and overstate the importance. And what I mean by that is that prior to the Bloomberg administration, and I think if you look across the country at most economic development agencies, what you'll see is that the main tool that those agencies use is a combination of tax incentives and real estate. And the reason I said that you can overstate the importance is that what those economic development officials will spend most of their time doing is going out and trying to target a project or a company. So XYZ company is looking to move its headquarters. There are 500 jobs. They give a giant tax deal. They make land available at a discount, and they have a press conference and say, look at how our city is improving. XYZ decided to locate here. What I came to believe was that that overstated the importance of economic development, because when you think about the scale of New York City, we are a city that today has well over 4 million jobs. When you spend a year trying to secure 500 jobs from one company, those 500 jobs are very meaningful for 500 families, but they don't move the needle at all in terms of the larger economy. And so what we came to believe was that there were actually much more important things, much more strategic things that we needed to do in order to make New York a more competitive city. And that was what we focused on. And I think the importance of those things often is underappreciated.
Interesting. I want to, and I might be wrong on this, I know that you had a law background and then you come to work for the EDC. And I don't know if you had a lot of, finance, economic experience, but here you are at this point, and I want to talk about the time frame too, because you came in 2003. I mean, 2008 was a big year for you, and the world was falling apart. And New York City was a very different place than it is right now. I mean, what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, in 2003, this wasn't exactly the case anymore, but certainly in 2002, when Mayor Bloomberg was inaugurated, it literally was the case that the embers at the World Trade Center were still smoldering. And there was no certainty and no guarantee that New York was going to recover, let alone prosper again. There were real concerns that businesses were going to leave New York wholesale, that concentration was a bad thing because it made companies vulnerable. People maybe wouldn't want to live in New York because they'd worry that it was a target. And so we spent a number of years trying to figure out how to make sure that we stabilized the city, and only then were we able to start to think about growth again. But the flip side of that was that because things were so dire, I think we were able to do things that in an ordinary time you wouldn't be able to do.
That makes sense.
One of the things that the administration did very early on, which we really redoubled our efforts in that respect after 2008 and the collapse of Lehman Brothers. But one of the things that we focused on was the fact that New York at that time was highly dependent on a single industry, which was Wall Street.
Yeah.
And Wall Street is an incredible asset to New York. It generates enormous wealth for the city. It underpins the budgets of New York City and New York State, but it's also highly volatile. What would happen in New York was that Wall Street would prosper and New York City and New York State would prosper, and then Wall Street would crash, and the same thing happened to New York City and State. And it was a very difficult way to manage a city. And so we started an effort to say, not how do we shrink Wall Street, but how do we grow other industries in order to make them stronger.
Yeah, and be more well-rounded, essentially.
Exactly.
That makes sense. I'm curious, so in 2008, you take over. Did you at any moment have like an oh shit moment, like this is 2008, whatever's going on, like now I'm steering the ship. It's a tremendous amount of responsibility. I mean, what goes through your mind at that point?
Yeah, well, I think I got the job in February of 2008, and the dominoes were falling even then, but I don't think anyone fully appreciated the cliff that we were heading towards. And then in September, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, it became very clear that we not only were heading towards a cliff, but we had gone over the cliff. And I remember the closest I came to the moment that you're describing is on the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed, Mayor Bloomberg asked the economic development team to come to City Hall, and he held a press conference. And as he's actually very good at doing, he basically sought to reassure New Yorkers that yes, it's a difficult day for New York. It's going to be a difficult several months, maybe several years for New York, but we're going to get through this. We've gotten through other difficult things, and we're going to be focusing on trying to cushion the blow. And then afterwards, my recollection is that we gathered in a room, and the mayor said, well, okay, we need to put together a plan. And so he left the room, and we all just kind of stared at each other because the world was falling apart. And New York City is a very powerful government, but relative to the scale of what was happening,
yeah.
There was nothing we felt that we could do. So that was an intimidating moment. But what we actually decided to do was a couple of things. One is that we decided that we were going to take a step back and do a very disciplined analysis of what was happening in the major industries in New York in connection with the downturn. We weren't going to rush into things that would have good propaganda value but wouldn't really be meaningful. We really wanted to understand, how is this downturn impacting these various industries? What are the challenges that New York is going to be facing? What are the opportunities? And we tried to put together comprehensive plans for each of the industries. And then the second thing that we did was we launched something which in some ways was a little bit of a Hail Mary, but we decided that we were just going to go out and talk to everyone that we knew and ask a very simple question. The question was, if there were one thing about New York City that you think that you could change, that you think would have the biggest impact on the economy of the city, what would it be? And what was interesting coming out of that exercise, which we called our Game Changers exercise, was that we started to hear a very consistent message. Mm-hmm. And again, this message is a little hard to appreciate today because of what came subsequently, but the message that we heard was that New York was a laggard when it came to technology, and technology was the future of the economy. And what people said to us was that the reason they thought that we were a laggard was that if you look at our competitors, if you look at the cities that are most successful in the 21st century in the technology industry, what all of them seem to have at their core is a critical mass of applied sciences and research and development expertise going on in them. And that in New York, although we have great universities, we just didn't have enough of them at a big enough scale relative to the scale of the city to really change things. And so coming out of that, in addition to those strategic plans that I was talking about for the industries, we decided to launch something that we called our Applied Sciences Competition, where we went around the world to all of the leading universities in engineering and applied sciences, and we said, we'll make you a deal. We, New York City, will give you free land, we'll give you $100 million in city capital, and what might have been the most valuable thing is we'll help you navigate the approvals process. And if you come and make a significant investment here in New York, we'll work with you to create something new and unique.
Wow.
And coming out of that was a brand new university, among actually several other things, but a brand new university that now is open and running on Roosevelt Island. That's a partnership between Cornell and the Technion, which is an Israeli engineering school. That has hundreds of students now and is spinning out businesses just as we had hoped. And I think the combination of the actual impact of that campus, but more importantly, the message that it sent to the world that we were really serious and we wanted to make New York not a laggard but a leader in technology. I really think that that was an important part of helping to turn the story around here.
I was going to say well, two things. A, when you went out, I guess, to the public, and when you have 10 million people or whatever it is, like how do you go about doing that and going out and getting, the right feedback and the right opinions from people to say, okay, this is what the public wants?
Well, this is true on that project, and it's just true more generally. The key with these things is always to start by asking people what it is that they want, what it is that they don't want. Whether you're redeveloping a neighborhood, you're trying to change an economy, or doing anything in between, you really want to make sure that you're understanding from people who are impacted by whatever it is that you're trying to do, what their hopes are and what their fears are. And normally coming out of that, a couple of things happen, actually more than a couple. One is that people just appreciate the fact that they've been asked. And it's amazing how many people just feel disrespected by the process. And rightfully so. The second thing that comes out of it is that you'll hear a lot of goofy ideas from people, and there will be a lot of people who don't understand how the world works or how what you do happens. But there are also, it turns out, a lot of good ideas. People who live in neighborhoods and people who live in cities actually understand their neighborhoods and understand their cities. And so you'll get good ideas. And then the third thing that happens is that you can bake those things into your proposal and come back to the public with something that maybe isn't exactly what it was that they were asking for, but rounds some of the sharp corners. Also you can frame it in a way that's different from the way that you might have framed it, emphasizing the things that they really care about and maybe de-emphasizing some of the things that would be more concerning. And so that process, I've come to believe, is the key to succeeding in a difficult and contentious environment like New York is.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, now that it's been a few years since the university opened, what kind of ripple effect have you seen through New York as a result? Positive, negative, other businesses coming?
So I think that I would answer that in three ways. I think that the direct impact of the university has been meaningful, but again, in the scale of New York City, relatively modest. And that's to be expected because the university has basically been open for something like 5 years, and it takes time to reach scale. They're still hiring faculty, they're still growing their student body. But even so, they actually have had an impact on the economy. There are companies that have come out of that campus that are now based in New York and employing people and attracting venture capital. So all of that stuff has been meaningful. As I mentioned before, the second thing that I think it did, which was probably even more important, at least at this point, I think that as it develops, the first category will become the most important part. But at least today, what's even more important is the signal that it sent to the market. And I've heard from a lot of people in the technology industry who have said that when the city launched this competition and then when it picked the winner and the winner announced that they were going to invest $2 billion in New York and start this new campus, and incidentally, Columbia also ended up being a winner of the competition and made an investment in their engineering school, and NYU opened a new campus in downtown Brooklyn. All of that together indicated to the world that New York was now a player in this business, and I think that was very important. And then the third thing that, which unfortunately didn't end up panning out, but I do think that part of the reason Amazon, when they announced that they were going to be going to Long Island City in Queens, the reason they chose that location was because it was across the river from the campus. And they believed that that campus is and was going to become an important part of the tech ecosystem. So although that specific project didn't pan out, I think that we've actually benefited from Amazon's attention that they brought to Long Island City, and so indirectly now we're also benefiting from the presence of the campus.
I know you've, I mentioned it before, you've worked on some unbelievable projects. I'm curious to know what your favorite one was and why.
Well, in city government, I would say that the project that meant the most to me was working on the rebuilding of the World Trade Center, just because what had happened was so horrific, and it was the reason I wanted to get involved in government in the first place. And when I first went to city government, New York City the government of New York City wasn't really involved much in the rebuilding. And about 2 years into my time, you probably don't even remember this, but there had been a couple of cornerstone laying ceremonies and announcements that rebuilding was going to start imminently, but literally nothing was happening. And we decided to inject ourselves into the process, use the bully pulpit that Mayor Bloomberg had, and really helped to shepherd the Port Authority, which owned the site, and Silverstein Properties, which was responsible for rebuilding, to the table and worked with them, ultimately very collaboratively, to come up with a new plan that once it was announced and signed, actually led to building on the site. And that was extraordinarily rewarding.
Yeah, I can imagine. I always talk about, so especially in this modern Instagram world, you have a lot of people that are out there projecting, happiness, success is easy. You basically, what drives me is to do the hardest thing. What drives me essentially is to do something that few people can do in the hardest place to do it, which is New York City, which is what you do on a daily basis. Can you talk about just in general some of the struggles? Because it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The things that you've accomplished are amazing, but to get there, I can't even imagine what that's like.
Yeah, and I think maybe just fast forwarding to RXR will be instructive, because as hard as it is to do things from government, in many ways, if you're working in public-private partnerships as we are, it's even harder to do it from the private side, because you suddenly lose all of the leverage and the power that government has, and the control of the levers that government has. And it really is all about persuading people to move in your direction rather than being able to force them, which is something that government can in fact do. And here at RXR, what we've been focusing on was initially what we called our emerging submarket strategy, which was looking at communities around the New York metropolitan area where there had been historic underinvestment, but where we thought that the underlying fundamentals were strong, and we identified either mission-driven organizations or governments that we could partner with to put in place plans to redevelop those places, and then we would bring private capital and hopefully economic activity to those communities. That over time has evolved into a broader strategy, which is what we realized was really what we were in was the public-private partnership business. And so we've been looking at other ways in which we could enter into partnerships with government, even perhaps a little unrelated to real estate, looking at things like infrastructure. So we're building a couple of terminals with JetBlue at JFK Airport. We're working on a project where we're going to be tearing down the Grand Hyatt next to Grand Central, working with the MTA to rebuild the subway station at Grand Central, and then building a 1,500-foot tall tower in its place with a new Hyatt in it. But to answer your question about the struggles, each one of those is unbelievably frustrating on a day-to-day basis, because you're dealing with the pressure that a developer has to try to figure out how to make really complicated, really expensive, long-term investments actually financially viable, which is a huge challenge in and of itself. You're then layering on top of that the need to work collaboratively with government, which very frequently has completely different motivations, is driven less by economics and more by politics, and also operates at its own very distinct speed. And then you layer on top of that communities and just the people who have their own set of priorities. And none of those priorities and none of those motivations of any of those parties are bad or good, but they're often in conflict. And trying to figure out how you reconcile all of them can be extraordinarily time-consuming.
Yeah, I can imagine. I actually grew up playing ice hockey with two members of the Reckler family. So I've kind of watched and seen the progression of the company, and I mean what you guys are doing is just amazing. And you're doing everything. I mean, started out locally on Long Island, Manhattan, spreading. I mean, now I don't know a lot about it. I would love to hear a few seconds about it if you could. There's a concept where I guess it's industrial space that you guys got involved in, where it's like, since most people now they're doing a lot more takeout in regards to to dining out. So the percentage of takeout is going up a lot more. So there's basically kitchens that run entirely off Instagram and social media. I know that you guys just made an investment in something like that.
Yeah, and listen, credit for all of this really goes to Scott Reckler, who's the CEO of RXR and is the visionary who's been pushing the company now for many years. But the evolution of the company is not just a geographic evolution from Long Island to the larger region, and not just a real estate evolution from being focused first on office parks and then eventually Class A office buildings, and later on these neighborhood-wide redevelopments and the residential space and industrial space. But it's also constantly looking at the direction that society is moving in. And so Scott is really focused now on this concept that he calls RXR 2.0, where it's figuring out how to use technology to overlay on top of real estate so that you can focus on the experience of your tenants, the experience of your users, and to bring the innovation that technology has brought to almost every other industry to an industry that in many ways is the most backwards in the economy, and that is real estate.
Last question, and it's kind of like a play off of that, but if you want to get a little more broad, what does the future look like for you personally, for RXR in general? What does the next 5-10 years look like of the evolution of all this?
Well, I think that it's a combination for RXR of more of the same and continuing to innovate and scale the business that we have in the areas that we've been historically focusing on. It's finding new opportunities that are consistent with those. And then it's this RXR 2.0 concept where the company is really looking to make sure that as this industry is disrupted, which it's inevitable that it will be, that we're on the vanguard of that disruption, and that we're figuring out how to use technology and to think about ourselves as not just a company that delivers a white box to businesses and says, okay, here you go, we'll see you in 10 years, but that we're a service provider, and that we're the curator of a culture and a community. And so I think that you're going to see much more of that going forward, and the opportunities for that, I would say, are almost limitless, and the directions that you can take that approach are almost limitless. And so I think it's going to be as exciting as the first 10 years of RXR's history have been. I think the next 10 years are going to be even more exciting.
It sounds like almost like you're creating an experience, like it's from like almost like a hospitality standpoint model.
Yeah, and the idea is to create mixed-use communities, and community is really the key word. You want to feel when you're at work like you're not just at work, you're in a place where there are lots of different types of people doing lots of different types of things, and you get to interact with them and benefit from the experiences that they have, and the interactions with them enrich your experience. And the same is true where in the place where you live, in the place where you play, when you stay in a hotel, all of that should always be within this community context.
Awesome. I can't thank you enough. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. As everybody knows, I'm the Handsome Homebuyer. If you have a house that smells like cat pee, is dated from the 1960s, commercial property, anything real estate related, if God created it and it can't be moved, I'm quick, I'm easy, I want to buy it. 516-777-SOLD. That's a wrap.
Orgulloso estoy de mi herencia judía. Benjamín Lev Ben Shlomo, cuando me llaman a la torre, así me llamo yo.